Hi, my name is Shan, and I'm looking at the question as to whether the law helps or hinders when it comes to diet-related illness. My background is in law, where I worked as a medical lawyer, and I'm currently a teacher at university and doing my PhD through the Sunshine Coast University, looking at how we might be able to proactively regulate for high quality, nutritious food. And I have two questions of focus for my research, which is how we define food at law and what we value when it comes to law. But first, I want to make a distinction between what we are perceiving as the problem when it comes to diet-related illness, because it seems like all of the efforts and attentions that we are making and the government funding around this issue is narrowly focusing on obesity and overweight, which in my view is a end product of a cause which has many factors. One of the controllable factors that I and a lot of other people have identified is the food that we're eating. So our actual diet and whether it is nutritionally adequate. That might seem like a subtle distinction, but it's actually quite large when it comes to viewing this issue through the perspective of the law. And diet-related illness has actually been an issue that is well known to the government in Australia. And as early as 1992, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare released a report where it gave a definition which said the major causes of death, illness, and disability in Australia thought to have a nutrition component in their etiology and for which some form of prevention is likely to be applicable are coronary heart disease, stroke, hypertension, atherosclerosis, some forms of cancer, stomach, colon, rectal, breast, and endometrial, diabetes, non-insulin dependent, osteoporosis, dental caries, gallbladder disease, non-cancer disorders of the large bowel, such as diverticular disease and constipation and iron deficiency anemia. And since 1992, we've also had more medical research which shows quite a strong correlation between diet and poor mental health, for example, or diet and immune deficiencies. Then we've got 26 years on, the AIHW releases another report called Australia's Health in 2018. Again, it really focuses narrowly on this issue of obesity and overweight. We are now ranking at number 5 of the OECD's developed countries when it comes to obesity and overweight, and the projected cost is something like $90 billion over the next 10 years in how we are going to meet this via our medical system. So that's a very narrow perspective, though. If we take into account the actual full ambit of diet-related illness, we can see that the problem is much larger than the way in which we are defining it at present. And that actually makes a real difference when it comes to how we look at this from a legal perspective. So let's actually weigh in the law when it comes to diet-related illness, which begs the question, what is food law in Australia? Do we actually have any law in relation to food, the nutritional quality of food? And the short answer is no, we don't have any law in relation to the nutritional quality of food. So where does the problem of diet-related illness currently fit in our legal framework? And well, it doesn't. Why? That's essentially a long answer which is loaded in with ideology, politics, and economic theories. And we could track that if we looked at the history of food in Australia and where it came from and how it's evolved. It's really difficult to summarize that in a few minutes because we've got Indigenous laws around food which were inextricably linked with the environment and their cultural and spiritual practices. And then we've got the importation of British laws, with the first fleet coming to Australia, and they were fed on weekly rations. Food law at that time was really in the form of a control. The government was using food provisions, and they controlled the rules of distribution of the rations. So it was an authoritarian expression of control of the people in the pursuit of the British government's colonialist prerogatives. And we see that continue for quite some time as the British are trying to build the nation, driving industrial and agricultural growth, and later to drive enterprises around the production of food to feed the masses, but then also to export food, which continued up until about the late 1970s, when we're seeing commercialization of food and fast foods and this strong emphasis around free enterprise, which coincided with globalization. And food laws at that time really focused on deregulation and food safety and quality. But we're looking at that in the sense of the market and how competitive we are. So we're actually looking at food safety in terms of being competitive. And information laws around food are really defined as consumer rights, but in the framework of consumer laws. And the ideology under consumer laws is that if there is a failure in the market, such as fraud and deception, then the market can't function well or compete to its best potential. So we're framing the value of food in terms of a commodity or a good rather than as to its nutritional value or its benefit to our health and well-being, let alone our human right to be nourished by our food. Why does this matter? Coming back to my research questions, how does the law value food? How does it define food? And what we can see is this very early definition of food with the first food adulteration laws, the 1894 Victorian Public Food Act, where there's this idea that food can really be any substance. So any substance doesn't have to be nutritional. It can just be any substance. We can virtually be eating anything that has no nutritional value. And it's interesting to see that then translate into our food law framework that we still have today when it comes to food standards and food safety. So we can see that definition translating its way through into the Food Standards Australia New Zealand Act, which is the foundation piece of legislation that we are working with under our FSANZ framework. So, does our problem fit within the FSANZ framework? Can it help us? The framework here is really limited. The way in which it evolved was primarily to address issues around trade and movement of food, cleanliness and sanitation as Australia urbanised, and then with the introduction of additives and chemicals, we've got laws about food safety, but in terms of composition. And the real ideological foundation or the basis of this framework is to promote free trade, to deregulate the trade of food. And we see that when we join with New Zealand as well. So even though we've got some food standards and we've got a food standards code, it's in relation to the composition of food, labeling and contaminants, but the way in which we value food and we define food here is any substance as a consumer product or a good. What's interesting is that in 2017, the Australian and New Zealand Ministerial Forum on Food Regulation agreed that whilst the food regulation regime was producing strong food safety outcomes, There were three priority areas for address between 2017 to 2021, and one of those was supporting the public health objectives to reduce chronic disease related to overweight and obesity. Yet, last year, an information paper outlining its proposals to review food safety standards actually excluded this issue of diet-related illness and chose instead to just focus on food safety standards. So FSANZ can't help us. What do we do when FSANZ can't help us? What have we got left? What we've got left is an ad hoc web of laws which indirectly relate to food. We've taken our nutritious apple and we've covered it in a web that isn't fit for purpose. So we are actually slowly poisoning ourselves with our food, yet we have no recourse in our law to do anything direct to affect this issue. We might be able to tax something, maybe we can address it via environmental laws, maybe we can argue a human rights approach. Certainly that's what the World Health Organization is saying that we should do, but we don't have a legislative basis for these things. So how do we need to frame this problem when it comes to the law? Well, public health advocates argue that diet-related illness is a public health nutrition concern. Like public health nutrition, the law has been a product of its own history. Public health errors have been identified in some recent research, which is really helpful because if we marry our law up with these errors, we can actually see that we are still stuck back in the 1940s, where we're waking up and we're going, oh goodness, we have an issue of double malnutrition. We're still stuck back there. Now, if you do a Google search about whether the law is reactive, you'll get something like 83,000 results. Australian food law is very reactive. Its continued focus is really on safety and standards, but it's not on nutritional quality. So what is the importance of the law when it comes to public health? Well, academics argue, and I agree with them, that without law, public health could not exist. Why? Because the government plays the unique role when it comes to public health. Its purpose is to mandate for the common good by prioritizing the population's health. The government can contemplate relationships between people and states and how to organize populations, and it has the ability to regulate to prevent rather than redress risks that are commonly shared. But what is our government doing? A little bit. We have an obesity task force. However, even though the Australian Government Department of Health website recognises that we have one of the worst diets in the world and overall we're very unhealthy, it suggests that the Australian approach is for people to take their own responsibility for what they eat and how they exercise, which since 1992, since we've had this information about diet-related illness, clearly hasn't worked. So we've got measures that are narrowly focusing on obesity, the result of the problem, rather than addressing the full ambit of diet-related illness. What does that mean when it comes to the law's role in diet-related illness? Does it help or does it hinder? If we bring it back to those two fundamental research questions as to what we value when it comes to food and how that determines how we define food at law, we can see that we do not value, let alone contemplate, public health nutrition when it comes to law. So I believe the result is in. The law actually hinders when it comes to proactively addressing this issue of diet-related illness. And it's my submission that it really is time that we take a proactive approach to this. And that is going to question how we define law and what our food laws value. And I think that I'll be calling for a new framework that we can work with that is fit for purpose, where we can address this issue. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'd love to hear from you and to share your research